I'm Nicholas Henshall, I'm the Dean of Chelmsford, and I'm standing outside Chelmsford Cathedral, and I want to bid you a very warm welcome as we go on a virtual tour in these times of coronavirus of this extraordinary building. A few words about this building behind me. I want to say something about its history, something about its architecture, and something about its purpose. This is a place where all sorts of things happen. We have great dinners and great balls, we have lots of worship, we have great civic events. Above all, though, it's a public space for everyone and a place where all are welcome. This building, or a building like this, has stood on this site since the 1240s, so that's some 800 years ago. It's built on the highest point in Chelmsford. Now, Essex is not known for its hills, so high points aren't that high, but at least it's above the river level, and that's quite a blessing when the river is so close. So a building looking something like this for over 800 years. And I want to say something from the outset before we go in, because when this became a Grade 1 listed building, what they said about it is the extraordinary thing is you can look at the building and wherever you look, you're seeing 800 years of history. Let me illustrate that. To my right over there is the tower. Now, that is the original tower of the building, although it's been built over many times. We had a lot of work done on it a few years ago. And our archaeologist said, I'm going to go and look for Roman stones. And I thought, Roman stones? It's not that old. And he said, no, wherever you dig foundations in Chelmsford, because it was a Roman market town, you end up finding Roman stones. I'm very glad he didn't find any, otherwise we'd have had to do more archaeology. But there are some embedded in there. So you can certainly see things from the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century in the tower alone. But just below it is some 16th century brickwork. The porch, which is just behind me, and we're going through that in a moment, is a medieval porch, and the room above it was the County Records Office for many centuries. And yet, in the form you see it today, it's a 20th century memorial to American airmen from the Second World War. So there are lots of different conversations going on, even in the architecture. On this side, you may see some very white-looking stone. In fact, it's not stone at all. It's made from ceramics. In 1800, two people rather foolishly undermined the foundations of the central part of the cathedral, and it fell down. And when they rebuilt it, they were fashionably trying to use new materials, and they found this man-made stone called Code Stone, which is also the stone used at Windsor Castle. Luckily, it turns out to be very durable, but it also makes it look very exotic. So under stone, there are flints, and then this wonderful white ceramic stone. But to add to this story, further along the wall, which is a medieval wall at that point, there's a Victorian doorway, so the 19th century meeting the 15th century. And then on the corner, there's a wonderful cutout modern sculpture of St Peter, one of our special saints here at Chelmsford Cathedral. But he's got great big rubber Wellington boots on and a massive Yale key. So what you see in a cathedral like this is culture, history and society in conversation throughout the history of this town and now this city of Chelmsford, as we seek to serve the city, the county and the region as a place of worship, a place for hospitality, and above all, as public space for everyone. You're very welcome. We've come into the cathedral through the south door, and we haven't gone into the main part of the building, but we've turned left, that's towards the back of the building, into one of the small chapels. Until quite recently, the chapels were simply storage space, and then there was a new vision for how these spaces could be used in a new way. And this has become a really beautiful space, and I want to introduce you to, in a sense, my favourite thing in this space, and in many ways, my favourite thing in this cathedral. But first, let me tell you about this chapel. It's dedicated to St Peter, who's one of the three patron saints of the cathedral. St Peter the Apostle, the close friend of Jesus, and there are various representations of him around the building. That's in honour of our connection with Bradwell, the chapel on the coast which the cathedral owns, the oldest church building in the UK. And that is dedicated to St Peter, and that's our fellowship with that space. But several other things are going on in this space which say something about the cathedral and what it represents. In the first place, this has always been the part of the cathedral, even when it was a storeroom, dedicated to remembrance. Above us are lots of standards from military action. There's a war memorial on the wall over there, and on all the other walls memorials. There are memorials from the First World War, the Second World War, the Burma Star campaign, the war in Japan. It's a place of remembrance. And that's a very significant part of what cathedrals are for, holding the memory. And here that's holding the memory of war and praying for peace. And in that context, you'll see just behind me 3 bottles of oil. And that may sound a bit strange, but those 3 bottles of oil are called the holy oils, and they're dedicated fresh every year on the Thursday before Easter by the bishop. And at the heart of that is the oil for healing. And so there's this incredible dialogue going on in this space between the cost of war and the prayer for healing. The prophet Ezekiel has this lovely line, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. So that's the prayer we have at the heart of this chapel. And then just beside me here is, well, I say it's my favourite thing in this cathedral. That's probably the wrong way of putting it. It's deeply, deeply shocking and stirs the emotions. This is a statue by an Austrian Jewish artist in response to the Holocaust. It's a picture of a woman holding her dead child across her knees. It is deeply, deeply shocking. And when I look into her eyes, she's not trying to blame anybody, but saying, look at the cost, look at the cost. And of course, in terms of traditional Christian art, this looks very like the traditional portrait of Mary holding the body of Jesus, what's sometimes called the Pietà. There's a famous one by Michelangelo in St Peter's, Rome. So in this chapel, we have a conversation. The cost of war and our prayer for peace, the healing of the nations and our individual healing, and this extraordinary statue that doesn't want pity and doesn't want to apportion blame, but simply says, look at the world and pray for a better future. We're now going to move to the other chapel on the other side of the cathedral, dedicated to St Cedd. Here we are in St Cedd's chapel in Chelmsford Cathedral. This is a place very close to my heart, because this is the place where through most of the year we as a group of clergy meet every morning and every evening to pray together. And so it's a place that's deep in my memory and deep in my heart as the place of our daily prayers. But it's also a remarkable space in its own right. It's dedicated to St Cedd. Now, that may not be a person or a name that's desperately familiar, but he in many ways was the fountainhead of the Christian message in Essex back in the 7th century. He came down from the northeast. He was a Yorkshireman, trained on Holy Island in Northumberland by St Aidan, and sent out to spread good news. His brother Chad, much more famous, went and founded Lichfield as a city and a centre of mission. Cedd came to Essex and founded churches at Tilbury and at Bradwell-on-Sea, and he trained people and sent them out to preach and teach the way of Christ. And for us, he's very important, not because there's a continuous link, because indeed, after St Cedd died, the East Saxons arrived and wiped out Christianity in Essex, and we had to begin again, but as a sign and a promise. In a sense, we're always starting again in every generation. So this is a chapel dedicated to the first Bishop of Essex, if you like, the first great Christian leader in this region. But the chapel, rather like St Peter's Chapel, has a whole load of things going on in it. Behind me, you'll see a little candle burning. That's the place where we store the leftover bread and wine from Holy Communion so that we can take it to the sick during the week. But it also has a focus of devotion, love and prayer. There are icons on the wall. Icons are an Eastern form of focus for prayer, and indeed many of the icons in the cathedral were created by the community, the Greek Orthodox community at Tollesham Knights, the monastery there, as a lovely gift in fellowship. But what I particularly want to talk about is not an icon, but this very blackened figure of Jesus. Rather like the bombed child, which I talked about in the other chapel, it is an extraordinarily powerful image. When we have tours at the beginning of each new year for the students at Anglia Ruskin, the chaplain always says, this is the most shocking thing in the cathedral. And what is shocking for many of those students who come from other cultures is that, of course, it is a naked depiction of Jesus. The Gospels are very clear about that. Jesus was naked on the cross. Of course, Christian tradition finds that quite hard, but this is a very naked and very shocking figure. Jesus is blackened and broken. He's utterly emaciated. And yet, this is the figure of the risen Christ. This is Christ risen from the dead, the one who reigns at God's right hand. And that's not just a nice piece of theology, that's something to do with the grounding of the Christian hope, that God in Christ has faced the deepest darkness about what it means to be human and has assumed that in his own suffering and death and carried it to glory. That means in Christian prayer we have the absolute confidence that when we stand before the Lord, we stand before a wounded Messiah who bleeds for love of our love. We're standing in the main part of the cathedral. In any church, this is normally called the nave. That's quite a strange word. It's simply a Latin word that means ship. And the reason that name got adopted for the main part is because the roof of any large building like this looks a bit like an upturned ship. In some unfortunate ways, it also became associated with the idea that the church itself was a great galleon, sort of going through the great seas of this world. I'm not sure that's a terribly helpful image myself, but the nave it is. And this is, if you like, the space for the people. This is where the congregation sits on Sundays. It's where great events happen, great gatherings. We even have the cathedral ball and the cathedral dinner in this wonderful space. We do put out a wooden dance floor to protect the floor itself and people's feet. It's space for everyone. And indeed, until really quite late, everybody recognised that the church buildings were not just worship buildings, but space in which we learnt, space in which we danced, space in which we ate, space in which we did stuff together. And I'm delighted that in the city and the county and the wider region, this cathedral is recognised as public space for everyone. I want to point out two features of this space. I said at the beginning, when I was welcoming you outside the door, something about the history of this building, and one of the curious histories is that in 1800, this entire part of the building collapsed. That was a result of two people deciding they'd dig out some graves underneath the main area. The result was the pillars fell down. And you can see around you there's lots of light flooding into the building. That's because what you're seeing is an 1800 rebuilding of a 16th century original that goes back also to the 13th century. There are actually several pillars on this side of me that are original to the building, but they're put in upside down because they couldn't quite work out which way to put them. Whereas the pillars on this side of the building are from 1800. I rather like that dialogue. And the reason this space is such an open light space is because in the 1980s, a new vision for the cathedral was implemented, which created this beautiful new floor, the fact there are no steps, literally there are no difficult thresholds to encounter, and the space is completely flexible. Everything in this building moves, except the altar, which we're going to visit in a minute, and the bishop's chair, where we're going to end this tour. But one other feature, you'll just see at the top of the picture a large figure of Jesus. It's a very modern figure, but also with very ancient roots. It's Jesus in majesty. He's wearing gorgeous robes. And we often say he's both welcoming us into the cathedral and sending us out of the cathedral. He's a figure I'm very fond of. And we see day by day and week by week at the heart of our worship. There are also lovely comic moments with that figure. One Christmas, a balloon got trapped in the roof space and we couldn't get it down in any way. And by Christmas Day, the balloon was actually in Jesus' hand. And we actually loved that. I think that says something about this cathedral. Yes, this is a serious place of worship, learning and fellowship, but it's a place of real joy and celebration, seeking to see the gospel not as something that constrains us, but something which sets us free. Where we're standing now, in a sense, is the heart of the worshipping life of the cathedral. This is a big table. We often use words in church that mean very simple things but don't easily communicate. So this is often called the altar, the holy table. I think that's the best word, called the holy table. And it's made of the same stone as the font where we baptize people and the bishop's throne, which we're going to visit in a minute. It's a huge slab of Westmoreland slate, and it's immovable. I rather like that. It means that this central focus of our worship has to be negotiated. So if we've got a big concert or staging or seating, this cannot be moved. And in a sense, it's the simplest thing in the world. This is the place where day by day we take bread and wine, bless and share it to remember Jesus. We do it on Sundays, we do it on weekdays. It's in response to that command of Jesus at the Last Supper, do this to remember me. But I also think there's something wonderful about the way this space has been imagined. When I look at pictures of this before the 1980s, this is crammed full of dark woodwork. Now, today we might have to fight very hard for the privilege of moving forward. I'm delighted they managed what they did in the 1980s. And what we have around us is just a wonderful sense of space. To the right of me, I know you can't see it, but when you visit the cathedral, do come. There's a beautiful fan arch with beautiful pictures beyond it of the tree of life. And in the roof space, there are stained glass windows of angels on one side, and then Greek icons of Jesus, of Peter, of Mary, and of St Cedd. And that's to focus in this space, not a privileged space exactly, but the space where the most sacred actions of the church take place. It's here where we bless bread and wine. It's here where we ordain people, where we marry people. This is a place where many life events take place. And it's wonderful to do that in a space which has been used since the 12th, 13th century as a place of worship, but which each generation has made itself new in fresh ways. This may seem an odd place to end a heritage tour of a cathedral, but in fact I'd suggest it's exactly the right place. This large seat, made of the same Westmoreland slate as the altar and the font in the cathedral, is called a cathedra. That's simply a Greek word that means a seat, but it's the reason this building is a cathedral. What makes a cathedral different? Well, that it's what's called the seat of the bishop, and this is the seat of the Bishop of Chelmsford. It's where he is enthroned at his or her consecration. At the moment, we're waiting for a new bishop to be appointed, and in a few months' time, that new bishop will be placed in this throne and become the Bishop of Chelmsford. That's not about power, it's about service. And I love it that whenever the bishop isn't here, which is of course most of the time, we place the Bible open on this seat as a sign of the real authority at the heart of the church, the living word of God, and the way in which we seek to respond to that. This is a beautiful part of this space, but often hidden. People often don't come up here. And the only thing I find quite scary is that just on the left where I'm standing is the statue of the first Bishop of Chelmsford looking down on his successors. And I think that's intended to give them a shimmer of fear when they begin their ministry. But behind the bishop's throne is this beautiful patchwork, which is made up of crosses that have been stitched by countless people across the region in the 1950s and 60s to create an extraordinary focus of people gathering together around the bishop. And I think it's a really beautiful piece of art, and one that we've recently refurbished and somehow sparkles with new life. But I want to finish at this point because this is why we're a cathedral. By the cathedra, the seat of the bishop. There are many other things that you can see in this cathedral church, and we're particularly known for our collection of modern art, which we use again and again to articulate the purpose of this building and the message of the Christian faith. In normal times, of course, the cathedral is open from dawn till dusk every day. You will notice as we've gone round, the cathedral's looking slightly different at the moment because we're filming during coronavirus, which has made changes to our life and changes to what we can do. However, even then, because at the heart of this, we see the cathedral as a thriving outward-facing community, as yes, the bishop's church, as a place shaped by worship, but above all as public space for all. Even through these times, it's been wonderful to welcome people through these doors, both actually and indeed virtually. People joining us through our website for daily prayer, for learning, for fellowship, for going on new journeys together as we discover in unusual times how to be a community of faith. So thank you for joining me here at Chelmsford Cathedral. It's been a pleasure and privilege, even in this unusual way, to do a heritage tour of this remarkable building, with its roots back in the High Middle Ages and its contemporary thriving life today. You are very welcome as pilgrims and guests.